Hi, happy Sunday. It's Purim today. Happy Purim. And we're going to be reading the last of the book of Esther, chapters 9 and 10. Now, in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, when the king's command and edict were to be put into effect, on the day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, it turned out to the contrary, so that the Jews themselves gained mastery over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities throughout the provinces of King Ahasuerus to attack those who sought to harm them, and no one could stand against them because the dread of them had fallen on all the peoples. Even all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and those who were doing the king's business were supporting the Jews because the dread of Mordecai had fallen on them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and the news about him spread throughout the provinces. For the man Mordecai became greater and greater. So the Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying, and they did as they pleased to those who hated them. At the citadel in Susa, the Jews killed and eliminated 500 men. And they killed Parshandata, Dalphon, Aspata, Porata, Adalia, Aridata, Parmashta, Arasai, Aradai, and Vaisata, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hamatata, the Jews' enemy, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. On that day, the number of those who were killed at the citadel in Susa was reported to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed and eliminated 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman at the citadel in Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your request? It shall also be granted to you. And what is your further wish? It shall also be done." Then Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let tomorrow also be granted to the Jews who are in Susa to do according to the edict of today, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the wooden gallows." So the king commanded that it was to be done so, and an edict was issued in Susa, and Haman's 10 sons were hanged. The Jews who were in Susa assembled also on the 14th day of the month of Adar and killed 300 men in Susa, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces assembled to defend their lives and rid themselves of their enemies, and to kill 75,000 of those who hated them, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. This was done on the 13th day of the month Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. But the Jews who were in Susa assembled on the 13th and the 14th of the same month, and they rested on the 15th day, and made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. Therefore, the Jews of the rural areas who live in the rural towns make the 14th day of the month Adar a holiday for rejoicing and feasting and sending portions of food to one another. Then Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to celebrate the 14th day of the month Adar and the 15th day of the same month annually, because on those days the Jews rid themselves of their enemies, and it was a month which was turned for them from grief into joy and from mourning into a holiday. And they were to make them days of feasting and rejoicing and sending portions of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews undertook what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the adversary of all the Jews, had schemed against the Jews to eliminate them and had cast pur, that is the lot, to disturb them and eliminate them. But when it came to the king's attention, he commanded by letter that his wicked scheme which he had devised against the Jews was to return on his own head, and that he and his sons were to be hanged on the wooden gallows. Therefore, they called these days Purim, after the name of Pur. And because of the instructions in this letter, both what they had seen in this regard and what had happened to them, the Jews established and made a custom for themselves, their descendants, and for all those who allied themselves with them, so that they would not fail to celebrate these 2 days according to their regulation and according to their appointed time annually. So these days were to be remembered and celebrated throughout every generation Every family, every province, and every city in these days of Purim were not to be neglected by the Jews or their memory fade from their descendants. Then Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. He sent letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, namely words of peace and truth, to establish these days of Purim at their appointed times, just as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had established for them, and just as they had established for themselves and for their descendants, with instructions for their times of fasting and their mourning. The command of Esther established these customs for Purim, and it is written in the book. Now King Ahasuerus imposed a tax on the land and the coastlands of the sea, and every accomplishment of his authority and power, and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai, with which the king honored him. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and in favor with his many kinsmen, one who sought the good of his people, and one who spoke for the welfare of his entire nation. So the Feast of Purim derives from Pur, which means lots. And we read about that in Esther chapter 3, when Haman cast lots. He cast lots day after day after day for the entire month, all the way to the 12th month. And what it was doing is like stones, colored stones, and rolling out the stones, and depending upon however they lay is his answer, whether it be yes or no, good or bad. And he would cast his stones, and my guess is maybe the answer of the stones, depending upon his behavior for that day or how he was going to treat Mordecai or the Jews. I'm not really sure on that, but nonetheless, that's what he was doing, is tossing these colored stones or possibly colored pottery to give him whatever he was seeking, an answer to whatever he was seeking. Also in history, King Ahasuerus has also been known by many to be Xerxes the First. So they are thought to have been one and the same. So let's talk a bit about this battle between the Jews and their enemies. It says that it turned out to the contrary. So the enemy was not able to get one up on the Jews. From what we read here, the Jews survived any and all attacks that no one could stand against them. So what are your thoughts on the amount of people that we see here that it says the Jews killed? They struck all the enemies, all of their enemies, all those who hated them. Verse 6 mentions 500 men. That number grows as we read further down. One thing that I would have to remember when I first read this book was, my goodness, I mean, they didn't go out and attack these people for the sake of attacking them. These 500 people came at them first. These 500 people had the heart to annihilate and destroy the Jews, and the Jews were defending themselves. And those 500 people, their lives were sacrificed because their desire to kill the Jews was stronger than their desire to live. Starting in verse 7 through verse 10, it mentions Haman's sons and what was done to Haman's sons. What are your thoughts on that? Why possibly the Jews felt the need to destroy Haman's sons as well? So after the 500, it's mentioned that the queen requests that Haman's sons be hanged for everyone to see, and the next day. And after that's done, it says that on the 14th day of Adar, they killed 300 more men in Susa. So 300 more came up against the Jews after seeing Haman's sons hanged. And then it tells us that the rest of that was just in Susa, that the rest of the Jews in all of the 127 provinces were defending themselves as well. And they killed 75,000 of those that hated them. Now, they didn't take their plunder. They're deceased. Anything that was of theirs that would have been left to their descendants was the plunder, which they were given the authority by the king to take as well. They didn't touch it. Not on one person that they killed, not one person did they take their belongings and plunder them. They simply defended themselves. It is amazing the amount of people that knew these things were happening, that knew the Jews were being successful in defending themselves, that knew there was a strong power behind them, continued to battle against them out of hatred in their hearts. It reminds me of what I read in Revelation. After Messiah is returned, his kingdom is here on earth. Those that are in Messiah will be with Messiah in his courts. But we read about those when the final battle occurs, that there are some people that haven't sided with Messiah, that are still against Messiah. And that just blows my mind that you're witnessing the Holy One in front of you and his beautiful kingdom that's described in detail with the beautiful gates and all of that in front of you, and that still is not enough evidence that what has been spoken in this word is true. So that's just what comes to my mind, is that regardless of what's happening, your heart is what's in your heart is what's in your heart. That's what you're going to do. That's what you are led to do. And we see that here all the way to 75,000 people in the 127 provinces rose up against the Jews and lost their lives because of it. So that's what today is. That's what Purim is. Purim is a day to remember this event truly happened, to know that there was a young woman who was placed into the king's castle. She had found favor. She was given wisdom. She was selected and separated amongst all the other ladies, put into a high royalty position, a place, again, like I had stated before, she never should have been. Kept her true self hidden, hence her name, Esther, means hidden, from Hadassah, her true birth name, and was able, because she was in a place already set by the Lord, in a place to be able to come to the king. Even though something horrible had been put up against her people, her entire nation, she was in a place that she could go to the king. She was able to make this request, and she was able to save, with the help of Mordecai, save their people. And Mordecai's determination to not bow down out of fear to things that hated him, to evil, but to stand up for what he knew what was right. And he wasn't going to let fear lead him. And all of these intricate details, we should never, ever forget. There's a history with God's people. There's always been a history. There currently is events happening against God's people, that there always will be until Messiah returns. If they being the evil one, if he and his messengers can eliminate evidence of the Holy One, then they can eliminate people seeking the Holy One. This battle is against our mighty God. It is not against us. We battle against them and against principalities, but the war is against our King, our Lord. I thank you for walking through the book of Esther with me and for celebrating this day of Purim. Shalom.